For this workshop, I'm going to be talking about how to power your data orchestration with Apache Airflow 3. I am going to start with some background for folks who might not be familiar with Airflow or not familiar with Airflow 3, which just came out. So I'll give an overview into the features. And then we'll have some hands-on exercises for you guys to do. I will be doing them along with you. So we'll talk about running Airflow locally, and exploring the new UI, writing DAGs, and using some of the new features. And then we will see, hopefully we will have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. Again, I'm going to start with some background. So before we get into the workshop portion, but I do just want to say right now that if you want to follow along with the hands-on exercises for this part, you are going to need a GitHub account. And then you have a couple of options for running Airflow locally. The best option is to use the Astro CLI. So I've got a shortened link to that here if you want to go ahead and install that. If you don't already have it, you can start that now. We also, in the repo that I'll be sharing later, have an option for running this with GitHub code spaces. So you will have that available to you as well if you can't use the Astro CLI for some reason. But you will need to run Airflow locally and fork the repo that I'll share in a little bit. So if you need to do any prep to get yourself set up, you can go ahead and do that now. Okay, but like I said, I will start with a little bit of background. So for anybody here who is not familiar with Airflow, it is an open source tool for authoring, scheduling, and monitoring data pipelines. It's hugely popular all over the world, both from a user standpoint, so it frequently sees over 30 million downloads every month. It's also very popular from a contributor standpoint. It's one of the biggest Apache Software Foundation projects that has over 3,000 contributors. So Airflow is used pretty ubiquitously all over the world for running data pipelines. And again, it's seen huge growth over the last 5 or so years. Airflow was originally created in 2014, so it's been around for 10 years now. But it has really taken off, especially in the last 5, and we've seen, huge growth in how Airflow is used. Not just for ETL and ELT type use cases like you would typically see for data pipelines, but also for orchestrating MLOps workflows and LLM ops and Gen AI workflows. So I know that has been spoken about earlier in this conference, and that's definitely something that you can use Airflow for. And I just mentioned that Airflow was originally created in 2014. That was inside of Airbnb, but it has since been open sourced. It's now a top level Apache Software Foundation project. And just a little bit of Airflow history for those who are not familiar. Airflow 2.0 was released in 2020. This was the most recent major version until about a month ago, and created or added features to make it more enterprise and production ready. So that was part of why we saw the huge growth that I just talked about on the last slide. And then minor versions of Airflow in the intermediate years have brought a ton of new features that make Airflow easier to use and applicable for more use cases. But again, with the kind of rise of MLOps and LLM ops and Gen AI use cases, there was a recognized need to make some bigger changes to Airflow that prompted a new major version. So Airflow 3.0 was just released in April of this year. It is the biggest release in Airflow's history. I'm going to talk today about some of the themes of this release and some of the features. And then, of course, we're going to cover some of the features in the workshop. And again, I always like to highlight that with the Airflow project, Airflow is a really strong open source project, and part of the reason for that is the huge community of people both using it and contributing to the project. A lot of the features that come in new Airflow releases, especially the ones in Airflow 3, we're going to talk a lot about DAG versioning today, but a lot of these came from the results of the annual Airflow survey. So folks who use Airflow and in the community talking about what they need from the project and how Airflow can evolve to suit their ever-evolving use cases. So I always like to make this plug both for a reason that you should use Airflow because of the strength of the open source project, and also to say that if you are an Airflow user, please fill out the survey. Please engage with the community on Slack or in the Airflow repo. Always great if you can contribute, but even if you can't, your voice in terms of what you need from the project is listened to. It's again what prompts a lot of the new features that are developed. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today that is new in Airflow 3, again, came out of prior surveys. So I just mentioned that Airflow 3 is the biggest release since 2020. There are way more features in this release than I could cover in just this short amount of time, especially since we've got a hands-on component. So I do just want to touch on three kind of key themes. And there's that Airflow 3 is easier to use, has stronger security, and has more flexibility on how and where, excuse me, I should say, where and when you run your tasks. So I'll just go through a very high level overview of some of these themes, again, especially focusing on the features that I'm going to cover here in the workshop. And the first is that Airflow 3 is easier to use, so it has an improved user experience. A couple of different features that I'll cover here. These three, DAG versioning, the new UI, and backfills are all part of this workshop, so you will get a chance to play around with all three of them. Just to give you some background so you're kind of prepared for what you're going to see when you play around with it yourself. The first is DAG versioning. So again, this is the #1 most requested community feature, I think, of all time. This is something that did not exist in Airflow 2. So DAG versioning is, just like what you would think from the name. It is the ability to track changes in your DAG code over time. For those of you who might not be familiar with Airflow, a DAG is just your data pipeline. So oftentimes these adapt over time as your use cases, evolve, but in Airflow 2, Airflow was only really aware of the most recent DAG code. So any changes that you made would no longer be reflected in the Airflow UI. It overwrites that history. If you made any code updates during a run, that could cause tasks to execute different code versions. Some people, myself included, have done this in the past while developing as kind of a fun race to see if you can fix the bug before your retry delay is up. But in production, this is actually behavior that you typically do not want. So again, just made this a little bit easier or a little bit harder to deal with kind of managing your pipeline code. So for example, if you were to, go from 2 to 3 tasks in your DAG and then reduce back to 2, you can see that that third task you added is now gone in the Airflow UI. You just can't see it anymore at all. If you had completely different tasks, again, you do not maintain that history. So again, this makes it really challenging to figure out what's going on, especially if you're working in a bigger team with lots of people developing on the same pipelines when those pipelines change. So now in Airflow 3, you have DAG versioning. This is a way to, again, track changes that are happening to your DAG over time within the Airflow UI. It's super, super easy to use. We will show how to do this in the workshop. There are a couple of different ways you can implement this feature, but the most basic one does not require any setup at all. It's going to be automatically applied by default when you're running Airflow 3. So very excited for that. Back to other features that are improving the user experience in Airflow. I'm not going to talk in my slides about the UI updates. We will just show that as part of the workshop. But I will talk for a moment about backfills. Backfills were something that did exist in Airflow 2, but they had a couple of downsides to them. They could only be run via the CLI, so you couldn't trigger them using the API or the UI. They ran in their own separate process through that CLI command. And so if you, it had different scheduling logic, so you couldn't apply the same logic that you would for normal runs. Also, if your CLI process dies, that backfill job dies. Backfills are often used in the real world to, reprocess historical data, especially if you're deploying a new pipeline or you need to, say, train a new version of your model on historical data. Because of that, it can often mean you're dealing with a lot of pipeline runs or a lot of data that you're processing. So obviously having that die in the middle is a pretty big downside. You also couldn't observe any progress or track the status of what was going on with that backfill or cancel the jobs if you needed to. So again, just not very easy to use. So backfills in 3.0 have full support. You can now trigger them from the UI, the API, or the CLI. The API has support for triggering async backfills. So again, if you're processing a lot of data, you have more ability to kind of manage the costs and resources associated with doing that. You have a great progress bar in the UI that will show up so that you can track the status and you're able to pause or cancel backfills at any time. And they are coordinated now by the scheduler, just like any other DAG run. So any logic that you apply to them in terms of how many runs you can run in parallel or things like that, you can now apply to them. So pretty cool. Um, I do want to go through for this group some of the other updates in Airflow 3. These are not going to be the focus of the workshop because they are more changes on the back end. They're a little less easy to get your hands on, but I think it's helpful for people to know about them. So the other theme in Airflow 3, or the next theme, is stronger security. Airflow 3, one of the big breaking changes in this new major release was an architectural change for what we call task isolation. So previously within Airflow 2, the workers, so the processes that actually run your task code that you define, would interact directly with the Airflow metadata database. This posed some security concerns and also was limiting in terms of how you could implement where your tasks get run. The new Airflow 3 has a new architecture. So there is now a component called the API server that allows the new task execution interface, or you might see task SDK, acts as an intermediary between your workers and the metadata database. So again, this is more secure. You probably won't, as an Airflow user, need to deal with this too much, except for if you run Airflow locally, you'll notice the components have changed. If you are responsible for deploying Airflow into production, you might have to worry about this. But again, just noting that this was a pretty great change that a lot of work went into, and it also opened the door for some of our other changes in Airflow 3, and namely the ability to run tasks outside of your Airflow instance. So one other big new feature in Airflow 3 is remote execution, which again means you can now run tasks on workers in remote clusters or outside of your Airflow instance. In the open source Airflow project, you would do this through the Edge executor, is what the package is called. And again, this is really helpful for anybody who needs more flexibility in terms of where they're running their tasks within Airflow, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry and you need to run certain tasks or keep certain data on-prem or in a private cloud, or if you work in hybrid clouds. Also, if you have use cases like ML or AI workflows that sometimes require, more compute power. So like a GPU or something, you can use remote execution to implement that. You probably don't want to run your Airflow instance itself on a GPU. I think that would be unnecessary. But you can, send workers to other clusters. So very, very powerful update here that, again, kind of makes Airflow more useful for more use cases and more companies. The last part of this is that there's also more flexibility for when you run your tasks within Airflow 3. So some of this we will touch on in the workshop. One thing is event-driven scheduling. So this allows you to set up your DAG so that they run rather than on a schedule, but when data arrives in another place, or more specifically, when a message arrives in a message queue. So right now, today, SQS is the supported message queue for this implementation. We won't actually do this in the workshop, but in the repo, I do have an exercise that talks about how you could implement this if you want to. We don't do it here because it does require that you have an AWS account with SQS, so not everybody might have that. But typically, AWS has a pretty good free tier. So if you want to play around with that after the fact, you totally can. And we've got a DAG in the repo set up so that you can do that. Another piece of this is event-driven scheduling was built on top of a concept called asset watchers. Assets in Airflow 3 are the next evolution of Airflow data sets. They are a collection of logically related data. If you've used data sets, you'll know that they make it a little bit easier for you to track data as it's flowing through your pipelines and use them for scheduling. Again, assets are just a more powerful implementation of this. We are going to touch on these in the workshop. Assets again, just like a data set could in Airflow 2, they can have a name, a URI, you can put them in groups, you can give them extra information. They're mainly defined by their name right now in the UI. Everything else is just additional information for you to track them. And again, an asset event is when that asset is updated. So that is something that you can use to schedule your pipelines. And again, as I just mentioned, assets can have a watcher, and that allows for event-driven scheduling so that Airflow DAGs can actually be scheduled based on something happening outside of Airflow. And again, that's only SQS right now, but certainly stay tuned in future Airflow releases for other systems to be supported there. I want to dig into assets a little bit more because they are a big part of the workshop. These are a different way for you to write your pipeline. So again, a great thing to get your hands on. There are a couple of ways that you can define or interact with assets in Airflow. The first is with outlets and inlets, which again is going to be a very similar pattern to how data sets worked in Airflow 2 if you were already using those or are familiar with them. Outlets let you assign an asset to a task and say that that task produces or updates that asset. They will show up in the DAG graph in the Assets tab UI as soon as that DAG is parsed, even if it hasn't run yet. So we'll look at that in a little bit here. And then you can also define inlets. So those are going to tell you which assets a task depends on. Note that this will give the task access to asset events for that asset, including if you attach extra information to them, but it does not affect the DAG schedule. So you can schedule a DAG on an asset, but defining an inlet does not allow you to do that. You still can't give specific tasks in your DAG a different schedule. And then now in Airflow 3, you also have a new way of defining these, and that's the @asset decorator. So this is used to create a single DAG with task code in Python that produces the asset. So you directly declare how you would create that desired asset. Again, collection of logically related data. So that might be a table, might be a file, might be a report, anything you need it to be. So you define that in Python. Using this decorator allows you to do that with less boilerplate code. So sometimes I've been referring to this as the more asset-oriented approach to DAG writing as opposed to the task-oriented approach, which was how it worked in Airflow 2. You can, of course, still use a task-oriented approach, and we use both in the code here that we'll show in the workshop. Generally, which you pick is just going to depend on your use case and kind of a matter of personal preference. But again, one thing to remember right now is that assets and DAGs are one-to-one. So if you use the asset decorator, it will define a whole DAG that produces that asset when it runs. And each asset, therefore, can have a separate schedule. So again, basics of this, we'll look more at this in the workshop in just a minute here with the exercises, but it's very simple to use. It will look kind of familiar to those of you who've used the task decorator, except for that, again, with an asset, you can give it its own schedule because it will create a single DAG, and then you're going to define a Python function that creates that asset. So again, that's whatever you need it to be to create the data that you're working with. In terms of updating an asset, or you might also hear this described as generating an asset event, there are a couple of ways of doing this. Again, if the DAG that is defined by using the asset decorator completes successfully, that is going to update your asset or generate an asset event. Again, asset is going to create a DAG with one task that produces that asset. Another way is, again, you can still assign assets as an outlet to a task. So if you're using a traditional operator or the task decorator, you can define an outlet for those. And whenever that task completes successfully, it will update that asset. You can still update them with a post request to the Airflow REST API. It's now an assets endpoint in Airflow 3 instead of the datasets update endpoint from Airflow 2. But that is one way that you can, update them from outside of Airflow potentially. Similarly, from outside of Airflow, if you have an asset watcher that listens for a trigger event caused by a message in a message queue, so that is just another way of saying you're implementing event-driven scheduling. And again, I'll say right now, SQS is available for that. Other message queues will probably be available in the future. And then you also can manually update them in the Airflow UI. So we will look at this in the workshop again, but there is a create asset event button, and you have two different options for doing this. I like to cover this because sometimes the language can kind of confuse people. But one option is materializing. So this is going to actually run the full DAG that has the task that produces the asset event. So again, either whether that's in a task or just an asset using the asset decorator. If you materialize, you're going to run all of that code. Um, you also have an option to do what's called a manual update, which just creates the asset event without running any task. So that's not going to run any code that actually generates that asset. It's just going to create a new event. This is useful for testing if you're saying, say, are creating your downstream pipelines based on asset events, and you just want to make sure that those are working correctly without actually running the code. You can do something like that. Okay, so that was the very, very fast version of what is new in Airflow 3. Again, we at Astronomer have lots and lots of resources for helping you get started with all of the stuff that I talked about. But for now, I want to go ahead and move on to the hands-on exercises. So in just a second here, I will be going through the exercises and demoing this. Again, highly recommend that folks follow along if you can. Again, for this, you're going to need a GitHub account, and then you have to run Airflow locally. So your two options for doing that that we have set up here are either using the Astro CLI, which is free for everyone to download. It does run on a container service like Docker or Podman. So if you can't install the CLI, the repo that I'm going to share is set up to use GitHub code spaces. So after you fork the repo, you can run it that way. There are instructions for doing so in the README in the repo. Again, I'll just note this is in the README, but folks often miss this. If you are going to use code spaces, you need to make sure to choose 4 cores. It will default to 2, and that will not work. So you definitely need to use 4 there. So again, that is a backup option if you don't want to use the Astro CLI. If you are going to use the Astro CLI, all you have to do is fork the repo and then clone it locally, and then run Airflow using Astro Dev Start. Again, all of the instructions for this are in the repo README. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here for just a second and throw this link in the chat. It was also in my slides. So again, that's how you can follow along. Again, hopping back to the repo here. Again, I won't go through the setup. I already have this running locally, but again, if you do want to follow along, which I highly recommend, go ahead and fork this repo and then choose which method you're going to use, either running locally with the Astro CLI or running with code spaces. Okay. Also, one other thing, make sure that you are on the Airflow 3-0 branch, and that is also relevant when you fork. Uncheck the fork the main branch only. The main branch doesn't have anything on it, so that will not help you. Okay, and then just a little bit of an overview for what this repo has in it and what you're going to build in this workshop. So the use case here is we have a company that provides a personalized newsletter service to its users. So users submit information about them and what they're interested in learning about, and then they get a newsletter with personalized information and motivational quotes and weather info and everything that you would want out of a newsletter. There are 2 different pieces that we use to implement this. One is an ETL pipeline that we've built with assets, or more accurately, is partially built, and we're going to finish building the whole thing. So that's this top part here. So we're going to have 3 different assets that do kind of the ETL part of this, and that's going to create the format of this newsletter. We then have a Gen AI pipeline that's going to do the personalization piece of it. So that's going to take the format of the newsletter. It's going to take in personalized information from the user that they have provided. It's going to send that personalized information to an LLM. And then it's going to put that into the newsletter and spit out the result. We have a slightly simplified version of this in the repo that you will work with, because again, to actually do the personalization aspect with an LLM, so the true Gen AI part of this pipeline, you would require a connection. The code I have set up in this repo uses Amazon Bedrock. So again, if you have an AWS account, you can play around with that after the fact. You could also certainly do it with OpenAI or any other service that has a model that you can interact with in that way. So we're going to work with a slightly simplified version of it that just does weather personalization, again, based on where the user says they are located. And then this pipeline in general is set up to run in kind of two different patterns. The first is what we would refer to for the Gen AI use case as a batch inference pattern. And that means that users are submitting their information through your website so that they can sign up for a daily newsletter. And every day you run this pipeline. So you put all of the user information together, you send it off to the LLM, get everything back, and then send out your emails. That's the one that within Airflow is going to be run like on a schedule. The other option for doing this is, say you want to make this more of an on-demand experience. So maybe a user is traveling and they want information for a different city or some sort of different prompt, and they want to be able to get it as soon as they fill out like a form on your website. The pattern there, again, using event-driven scheduling in Airflow 3, is that the user is going to submit something on your website, which would on the back end send a message to a message queue like SQS, and that is going to trigger the pipeline with the specific information for that user so that this can run on demand. That's more of an ad hoc inference execution pattern. And again, that's possible because of event-driven scheduling. Again, outside of the scope for what I will cover today, especially because it does require connections to other systems outside of Airflow. But if you have an AWS account and you want to try this yourself, you totally can. There are instructions on how to do that in the README of the repo. It's at the end as like an optional exercise. Okay, so first exercise here is to explore the new Airflow UI. So I'm going to go ahead and just demo everything in the workshop. Again, I highly suggest that you follow along if you can, or you can do this afterwards. So hopping over to Airflow, this is the new and improved Airflow UI. If you are just opening this for yourself, you actually won't see anything here. You won't have any DAG runs or asset events to show. That is normal, and you'll change that in just a minute. The new UI obviously looks a lot different. If you are familiar with Airflow 2, it's much more streamlined. It looks a lot cleaner. A lot of attention has been made to making it faster and more performant, as well as more accessible to folks. So the homepage is just going to give you kind of a health check into what's going on. And then the first part of our exercise is exploring the DAGs and assets tabs, because again, these have been redone. So if you are, again, familiar with Airflow, you will notice the DAGs view looks a little bit different, but these are all of the DAGs that I have in this environment. So we're starting off with 3 of them. Also hop over to the assets view. This is just first going to list our assets, but if I click into one of these, we will see the graph here. So this is going to show us a nice view, kind of similar to what the old datasets graph view showed, but again, this is now updated for assets. So this is going to show us the dependencies that we have between assets in this environment. And the assets here are the ones with the little database on them, and the DAGs are the ones with the little graph kind of icon here. So you can see that we have 2 separate DAGs that produce assets and a dependency between them. So the first is getting quotes from a database. The second is doing some transformation on them. So we're starting off here with the extract and transform parts of our ETL pipeline. That is all we have so far. We don't have the load step yet, so we will try that in just a moment. The next part of the exercise that I have for folks is to unpause those DAGs. So you can see I've already done that in this environment. I'll go ahead and trigger this raws end quotes again. We're just going to trigger a single run. So that's going to run in just a minute here. And this was super, super fast, but you should have seen that that also triggered selected quotes. And again, because of that dependency that we just saw in the graph view, you can also see that the schedule of the selected quotes is another asset as opposed to like a daily schedule. So this is raws end quotes. So that means there's a dependency between these. This asset is going to materialize or run when this raws end quotes asset has completed. So again, just chaining the dependencies in our ETL pipeline. Okay, so that's one part of the exercise. The next part is unpausing this personalized newsletter DAG, which you can see if you unpause it because it's on a daily schedule, it will trigger one run to start, and that run is going to fail. This is expected, and we will fix it in just a minute here. But one thing that I want to point out within Airflow 3, one of the best things in the new UI is that it's now much easier to get to the task logs of failed tasks. So this is an example where if I click into this task instance, it immediately takes me to the logs and filters to the error here. So you don't have to click through several different tabs to get to the logs. You can also do this from the DAGs page and quickly get to, again, whatever failed. This is a mapped task, so I've got several instances in here, which is why I had to do that extra click. But again, these are surfaced much easier so that you don't have to find something that's buried to figure out what went wrong in your task. Again, this is saying that there is no newsletter template, again, because we haven't actually added that task yet. So this failure is expected. And we will fix that in just a minute. Okay. And then the last thing I want to point out, just here in the new UI, there's a lot of other stuff to explore here that I think is best figured out by just exploring yourself. But I will point out that based on popular demand, there is now dark mode available. This is now fully supported in Airflow 3. So lots of folks are very excited about that. I personally think it's a little easier to demo actually from light mode, so I'm going to switch back. But I know lots of developers who use Airflow have already switched mostly to dark mode. Okay, so I will go ahead and keep moving. So the next exercise, this was the first one, again, designed to explore the Airflow UI. So again, that's something you can keep doing on your own. The next exercise is to use assets. So again, something I talked about in the intro. Assets are a different way of writing your pipelines in Airflow 3 and defining the data that you want to be available and then the Python that you need for that. Within what you have already, I mentioned that what we need is an ETL pipeline that has 3 steps. Right now, we only have 2 steps. And again, these are both generated with assets. So if I look at one of these, this is just a DAG that was created from this asset. If I look at the code, you can see that I've defined this asset here and given it a daily schedule. This is the one that's grabbing data from an API that's creating a DAG. You'll notice there's also another asset in here, and that's the next one, the selected quotes. Even though these are both 2 separate DAGs, I've defined them in the same file. The typical pattern with task-oriented DAGs is to define 1 DAG per Python file within Airflow. You could still do that if you're using assets. For the purpose of highlighting that these are part of the same logical ETL pipeline, I've put them in the same file. But again, it's totally up to you how you want to do that. So what we need to do here is add the load step or the final step in our ETL pipeline. So we're going to add another task that creates the formatted newsletter. There are instructions in the README here on the code. So this is the Python code that you should use to create the asset task. So a chance for you to play around with the asset decorator. So you'll want to create a new asset in that same file, call it formatted newsletter, use this Python code, and then give it a schedule. Okay, so for any folks following along, I'm going to go ahead and give people just a minute to do that, and I'll leave this up. I'm actually going to do it myself here on the back end, and then I will circle up in just a minute and show you what this looks like. Okay, let me hop back over to my assets view. So I have gone ahead and added this in my DAG. You can see that I now have a new asset here that is called formatted newsletter. If I look at the graph, we can see where I've added that. If I click into it, you can see the results of the code. So again, in that same file, I've just added a new asset here called formatted newsletter. I've given it a schedule on the previous asset, so the selected quotes. And then I have added all of the code that was provided there. So this is, again, the load step in our ETL pipeline. Okay. Now, next thing that we want to change here is we've got the full pipeline with our ETL thing. But remember that in our formatted newsletter, or excuse me, the personalized newsletter DAG, this one is failing. And that is because it is relying on the template that is created by our ETL pipeline that hasn't actually been created yet. So this DAG requires the ETL pipeline to run before this can complete. Otherwise, you might run it successfully if it happens to, if your ETL pipeline has already happened to run, but it would be better to update the schedule of this so that that's actually coordinated on the Airflow side. So the next part of this task is to change the schedule of this DAG so that it runs after that last asset has completed the formatted newsletter instead of on a daily schedule. So again, I'll go ahead and pause for just a minute and I will go ahead and make that update and give everybody else a chance to do that as well. Okay, I want to refresh this here to show you the updates. So again, now in our asset graph, you can see that this is all tied together. So our personalized newsletter, I have changed the schedule on this so that it runs only after the formatted newsletter has run. So you can see the updated schedule here. Again, how you do this, there is example solutions are in the repo if you have any questions on that. But now if we go back to our DAGs and I run this again, this should trigger everything to happen downstream. Oops, I need to actually turn this one on. Make sure to unpause if you haven't already, and then hopefully we should see the personalized newsletter run and actually succeed this time. So you can see that just happened. Oops, not sure why my new DAG run. There we go. So we can see this was now asset triggered and ran successfully. Okay, so pretty cool. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next exercise I want to cover focuses on the backfills feature. Again, this is to help you reprocess any historical data. So that can either be if you deploy a new pipeline and you need to run it for the past 6 months. Also very relevant for a lot of ML workflows because you might need to deploy a new version of your model and retrain it based on historical data. You have the option to only rerun past failed runs of your DAG as well. So again, this is now fully supported and super easy within Airflow 3. So I'm going to go ahead and this is in exercise 3, trigger a backfill of the raw Zen quotes DAG. So this is the first one. Again, note that if you're just playing around with this, backfills we're going to look at it in just a second here in this form. So you go to trigger and then select backfill. And then you can go ahead and pick a date range and the behavior that you want it to use. So either just reprocess missing runs, both missing and errored, or everything. So if I go ahead and say pick a date range here from say 62264. Importantly, this tells me that 2 runs will be triggered. So I can go ahead and run this backfill. It's going to kick this off 2 times. This is something to be watchful of. Again, if you need to manage resource utilization, nobody should have any issues by running this DAG a couple of times. If you were going to run an actual production DAG, say hundreds or even thousands of times, you might want to be careful with that. So it's nice that this tells you how many runs will be triggered. You can control the max active runs here. So if you want to, say only 10 of them can run at the same time, but you need to run 100, then Airflow will, manage that. Another thing to note is if you are just playing around with this feature and you go into a DAG and you pick a date range and it says no runs will be triggered, there are a couple of things to look at. One is the reprocessing behavior. So if you say don't have any errored runs and that is the only thing that would be re-triggered, then you won't get any. If your DAG does not actually have a time-based schedule, so say it is scheduled on an asset, then it doesn't have by default any missed runs ever because it was not set up to run on a schedule. So for the other DAGs in this repo, if you were going to backfill, you would not see anything show up here, again, unless they had an errored run in the past that was within that time range. So let's go ahead and trigger this. We now see this awesome bar here, so we can see the backfills, we can pause or stop. This one is actually really fast. So again, if I refresh this, we can see the backfilled runs here. They have these little backwards arrow on them to indicate that they were backfilled. And again, these were super fast and have already completed, but if they took a long time, you would see them running and you could also pause or stop them. Again, because this is the first DAG in our pipeline, we should have seen our other DAGs also run a couple of more times. So we see those here. Again, everything's pretty fast in this case, so these have already run. But something else to note with backfills is that if the DAG that you're backfilling has assets, that then have other DAGs scheduled on them, that those will trigger as well. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get to the last exercise here. So again, hopefully you've seen that backfills are super straightforward and easy to trigger. The other big user experience feature that I covered in the overview was DAG versioning. So I want to look at that a little bit. And we actually should have, let's see. I don't have a new version of this task yet. So what we're going to do is create a new version of this personalized newsletter DAG. A couple of things to note about DAG versioning. There are only a couple of things that trigger new versions in the DAG, or I should say only certain changes will prompt a new version. So it requires a change to the structure of the DAG or something that would change the way in which Airflow scheduler manages the DAG. So changing something like the schedule, we can see, which we did for this personalized newsletter DAG, should actually change the version. So we can see that here. You saw me just a second ago look for it in the grid view. I'm still getting used to this, but because that didn't actually change the structure of the tasks, it doesn't give me that option here. But if I go to the code of the DAG, you can see my versions here, and I have V2 and V3. So my V2 is still going to have the original schedule of this DAG, which was daily. Now on my V3, this is the change that we just made to update that schedule. So I can see the different code here. So changing something like the schedule, again, is going to change how Airflow actually parses this DAG. Or not parses, but how it runs the DAG. So that will prompt a new version. Another thing with changing the structure is adding or removing tasks or changing the task names. Importantly, one thing that I kind of point out in the exercises is that changing the actual code within a task does not change anything as far as the Airflow scheduler is concerned. So that will not prompt a new version. But the next exercise here is to go ahead and make a change to the stack that's going to create another version that we can see here in the graph. So again, some instructions for this are in the README. You can just add any task. I'm going to do one that just adds some simple math in Python. But let's go ahead and take a moment to do that. And then I will come back and show this in just a second. Okay, I have made my change. I'm going to give that a minute to parse. All right, let me go ahead and go back to this and see if my new task has shown up yet. And it looks like it has. So, interesting though that I'm not seeing this in the graph. Oh, because I'm still on V3. So you could, a minute ago, we just looked at V3 of the stack, which is has these 3 tasks in it. You can now see that we've got a V4, which is where I added a task. This task doesn't actually do anything other than some math. You can see it's not connected to the others, but this is just to highlight for you that you can now flip between these in the UI. If I run this tag again, you will also see that difference show up in the grid view. So again, this task isn't really going to do anything, but this is going to highlight that this task that I just added, you can actually see in previous runs of the DAG where that task didn't exist, but you can still see it here. If I were to take it away, I would get another version, but you would still see this maintained. So you would see that for this particular DAG run, this task ran. But it has since been removed. So again, you no longer have the issue in that history where if you remove a task, it's just gone forever and the history is gone. You have no idea what happened if you have to go back and debug that. So super helpful for, again, just maintaining that auditability so that you can figure out what was happening in your code at any given DAG run. Okay. Great. So I'm glad some folks were able to, download this and get started with it. These were most of the exercises. Again, I will note there are a couple of other optional things in here for kind of future work. I'm going to talk about Astro more in just a second here, but this is optional if you want to create a trial and deploy this for kind of if you were going to run this in production, play around with a managed service. You have that option for you. Also, I mentioned earlier, there is a version of this where you can run this as a Gen AI DAG with event-driven scheduling. So that means it's going to actually connect to, in this case, Amazon Bedrock for the LLM output, and you can use SQS for event-driven scheduling. There are instructions for how to do that with one of the DAGs that's in the solutions folder here. So again, that does require that you have an AWS account and access to Bedrock and SQS. So certainly not required, but if it's something that you are interested in playing around with, you have all of the instructions for you to do that here. Okay. Again, I will make a quick plug for if you are wondering, like, what is the next step? This is great. I played around with this locally, but how do I run this in production? And you are new to Airflow, or you want to play around with some of the other Airflow 3 features like remote execution. You can do that on a free trial to Astro. This is Astronomer's managed Airflow service where you can run Airflow just as you have here. So the Airflow experience is going to be very similar, but you have some additional features on top of that. So QR code here, in case anybody is interested, you can get that free trial and work with that if you, or if you just want to play around with it more and you don't want to do so from GitHub code spaces or locally.